Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are in the world, our lecture in the Harvard Asia Center Philippine Lecture Series. My name is James Robson, a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and also the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center here. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Professor Stephanie Mawson, to give today's talk, which is entitled Mountain Perspectives, Histories of Flight and Resistance in the 17th-Century Philippines. Professor Mawson is currently a research fellow at the Instituto de Ciências, Sociais at the Universidade de Lisboa, and a former research fellow of St. John's College in Cambridge. And I just learned she'll soon be taking up a post at York University as an early modern Southeast Asia history position. So congratulations on that. She received her doctorate from the University of Cambridge in 2019, where she was a Gates Cambridge Scholar and a fellow at the Institute of Historical Research. As an historian of empire and maritime Southeast Asia during the 16th and 17th centuries, her work primarily focuses on questions of indigenous agency, resistance, and sovereignty in the face of European imperial expansion, as well as global connections across Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds. She's published a number of very interesting articles in journals like in the journal Past and Present, Ethnohistory, and the American Historical Review. Some of the topics of those essays have covered things like folk magic in the Philippines from 1611 to 39, and a fascinating co-authored paper on science and islands in the Indo-Pacific worlds, which I found particularly interesting, and also another article entitled Convicts or Conquistadors, Spanish Soldiers in the 17th Century Pacific. Her most recent publication is a book that came out from Cornell University Press, which is entitled Incomplete Conquest, The Limits of Empire in the 17th Century Philippines. In that work, she really uncovers the limitations of Spanish empire in the Philippines and unearthed, if you will, the histories of resistance and flight, evasion, conflict, and warfare across the Philippine archipelago during the 17th century. The Spanish colonization of the Philippines that began in the 1560s has long been seen as this new era of globalization and drawing together multi-ethnic worlds of merchants and soldiers, sailors, missionaries, and these colonialists sent reports back to Madrid that were celebrating all of this, a number of conversions that they made. And her book gets into how this is constructed and a kind of part of a construction of an imagined imperial sovereignty that was not accompanied by the effective consolidation of colonial control in the many of the regions where these conversion and tribute collections were imposed. So it's a really fascinating look at this time period. And I trust that some of what will be discussed today will be related to some of her previous work. So thank you all for signing on today. We will have some time after Professor Mawson's talk for a Q&A, and you will be able to use either the Q&A box or function on Zoom, or you can use the raise hand function and ask your question live. But first, join me in welcoming Professor Mawson for her talk, Mountain Perspectives, Histories of Flight and Resistance in the 17th Century Philippines. And I turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Great, thanks. I'll just share my screen. So yes, thank you to Professor Robson for inviting me to speak here at this seminar, and it's really lovely to be here with so many Philippine scholars and people who are interested in Philippine history from around the world. What I want to talk to you about today is the role of mountains within the early colonial history of the Philippines. So what I'm going to present here does draw on two recent publications. The first is my article from the most recent issue of the American Historical Review on escaping empire, as well as also my monograph, Incomplete Conquests, which was published earlier this year with Cornell. Okay, there we go. So the book charts the complex story of how, despite more than a century of Spanish claims to sovereignty over the Philippines, by the end of the 17th century, the Spanish presence in the archipelago remained weak, unstable, and limited. And I show the multiple ways in which Philippine communities defined the limits of empire territorially, economically, spiritually, and militarily, such that Spanish colonial control was constantly frustrated and contested. And one of the main points that I explore in the book is how different historical vantage points change the way we understand colonial histories. Too often, as historians of colonization, we can fall into the easy path of viewing events from the perspective of the colonial state. And in many ways, this makes a lot of sense, since this is the perspective most readily accessible to us within the colonial archive. But to write histories that focus on indigenous people, so to try to adopt an indigenous-centered approach, this requires both different methodology, so the incorporation of different source bases and an engagement with other disciplines, but also a conscious interrogation of where we are choosing to view this history from. So for this reason, in this presentation, rather than beginning in Manila, the center of colonial control, instead of beginning there, I'm going to propose that we adopt a mountain perspective to look at the history of colonization in the Philippines and to see how this changes our view. And what I'm going to argue is that the view from the mountains is very different to that presented by the colonial authorities in Intramuros, Manila. From the mountains, empire appears patchy, unstable, and incomplete. So most people who are at least a little bit familiar with the colonial history of the Philippines would be aware that mountains played a particular role as sites of resistance to colonization. And this is particularly the case for the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon, where indigenous communities, often grouped together under the name Igorot, famously rejected colonization attempts for more than 3 centuries. And these communities of the Cordillera are to this day seen as examples of authentic indigeneity because of this long history of resistance to colonization. And they are often contrasted to their lowland neighbors who are seen to be wholly subjugated by colonial powers and to have therefore lost their indigenous status. But what's perhaps less well known is that particularly prior to the late 18th century, the Cordillera was actually not unique. And later on, I'm going to show you some maps of the full extent of zones of refuge within the Philippines in the early colonial period. While not all zones of refuge were mountainous, upland spaces presented common advantages across a wide array of geographies, allowing indigenous communities to make use of colonial perceptions of remoteness and the friction of terrain to escape empire. Flight and migration were part of a widespread and consistent response by Philippine communities to Spanish colonization, and these responses occurred across the breadth of the archipelago, and they mirror strategies used by indigenous groups both elsewhere in the Spanish Empire and also in other imperial contexts. At the same time, upland communities interacted frequently with their lowland neighbors in a way that fundamentally limited the nature and extent of colonization in the lowlands as well. So to make this argument, I'm going to first begin in the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon, this famed heartland of upland resistance to colonization. And this will allow me to introduce the topic, but also to raise some questions about the connections between events in the Cordillera and in neighboring lowland communities, particularly in the Cagayan Valley. And from there, I'm going to take a look at the same phenomenon of flight into upland spaces in other parts of the archipelago. And this will help me show how the history commonly told for the Cordillera is actually replicated elsewhere. Philippine mountains presented examples of insurgent ecologies, to borrow a term recently coined by the historian Catherine Benjamin Golden in reference to slave resistance in the Great Dismal Swamp. Whereas mountains might have been unruly in the eyes of colonial administrators, frustrated by their inability to control both territories and peoples, their ecologies were insurgent because they facilitated the reversal of colonial power, making them particularly successful zones of refuge. So firstly, to begin with the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon. So the Cordillera mountain range is vast and impressive. It rises sharply from the western coastline of northern Luzon, and it stretches for nearly 300 kilometers from north to south. And the early Spanish explorers described these mountains as eerie and barren, with ecosystems of thick tropical pine forests that were often shrouded in dense and humid fogs. Thunderstorms frequently boomed across mountain passes, and fast-flowing streams cut courses down slopes and through rugged ravines. Towering above, summits reaching nearly 3,000 meters, peaked above an ocean of clouds, a place where the earth meets the sky. And this region first came to Spanish attention because of rumors of productive gold mines hidden within these mountains. The successive attempts to explore, conquer, pacify, and convert communities in these mountains were met with fierce and violent resistance. Both Spanish armies and missionaries were consistently forced to withdraw from these attempts, and the Cordillera became a space beyond the colonial frontier, where indigenous communities persisted for centuries outside of European control. Now, the term Igorot, which is applied to the indigenous people of these mountains, is actually a lowland term that means people of, pardon me, I've jumped forward. Yeah, Igorot is actually a lowland term that means people of the mountains, and it has often been used to group together the multiple indigenous communities who share this history of resistance. But in fact, Igorot territory encompasses 6 different ethno-linguistic groups: Bontoc, Ibaloi, Ifugao, Isneg, Kalinga, and Kankanai, and only some of these groups today identify with the term Igorot. And one group which does not identify with the term Igorot is the Ifugao, who are renowned as the architects of one of the Philippines' most famous indigenous historical landscapes, the Ifugao rice terraces. As we can see, these terraces make use of rugged mountain geographies to defend villages against local intercommunity conflict, while providing them with life-sustaining agricultural surpluses that allowed them to escape domination from outside forces. Within Philippine historical consciousness, these terraces stand as poignant emblems of indigenous upland resistance that allowed the Ifugao and other inhabitants of the Cordillera Mountains to remain autonomous from colonization for more than 3 centuries. And now listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the extraordinary engineering of the Ifugao rice terraces has prompted debate over their antiquity. So an earlier generation of anthropologists and archaeologists believed that such extensive terracing could really only be the result of literally thousands of years of indigenous landscape modifications. The rice terraces were therefore interpreted as examples of long-term indigenous persistence in the mountains, where communities remained untouched by colonization and able to expand these impressive terraces. But more recently, the archaeologist Stephen Acabado has demonstrated that these rice terraces are actually a much more recent feature of these mountains, that they were built between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And this coincides with the time when Ifugao became a zone of refuge for lowland communities fleeing Spanish colonization in the neighboring Cagayan Valley. So Acabado's findings substantially change our understanding of the history of Cordillera resistance. Mountain communities in the Cordillera were not untouched or isolated from colonization. Instead, they became zones of refuge for thousands of lowland migrants wishing to escape subjugation by the Spanish. And so, while the Spanish viewed mountain spaces as unruly, unsubjugated zones beyond the colonial frontier, frequent reports of flight into these spaces demonstrate that they were never really disconnected from their lowland neighbors. And the famed history of Igorot resistance is not as exceptional as we might have once thought. We have oral histories recorded from different sides of the Cordillera which document the same kinds of migration patterns occurring in response to colonial labor regimes or to activities like the building of a new road that threaten to disrupt existing ways of life. And also archival records document this history of flight, particularly from the Cagayan Valley. So the Cagayan Valley neighbors the Cordillera mountain range, and it's rimmed on three sides by three different mountains. And numerous interconnected waterways bring mountain waters to expansive lowland plains that stretch for more than 28,000 square kilometers. In the 16th century, Cagayan was both fertile and populous, and the valley seemed an obvious place for spreading Spanish colonial power. Despite this, the multiple communities of Cagayan all repeatedly and violently resisted colonization attempts, making the Cagayan Valley one of the most unstable of colonial frontiers for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. Particularly early in the 17th century, colonization attempts were accompanied by frequent violent rebellion that preceded flight into the mountains to evade colonial control. One typical example of this took place in 1625 within the Isnag villages of Kapinatan and Putol in the foothills of the Apayao Mountains in the northeast of the Cordillera. In June of that year, two Isnag leaders attacked two Dominican priests while they were taking their evening meal. They decapitated one and severely injured the other, who was later cut to pieces and thrown to the pigs. And this acted as a signal for all of the remaining Isnags of Kapinatan and Putol to rise up and flee into the mountains, setting fire to their churches as they retreated. So these rebellions that took place in the early 17th century established the limits of Spanish colonization in the valley, with tribute collection and missionary activity confined to the northern coastline and the banks of the Cagayan and Chico rivers. Following the violent uprisings of the 1620s, attempts to push further into the valley were actually halted for another half-century. So rebellion was so successful in Cagayan because of these limits of colonial control. Cagayan communities were able to simply retreat further into mountain spaces. And the choice of which mountains to retreat into differed from community to community. So while the Isnags of northwestern Cagayan fled into the Apayao Mountains, the Italas of the Chico River region retreated into the Kalinga foothills, and the Gadangs and Ibanags of the eastern banks of the Cagayan River sought refuge in the Sierra Madre Mountains. And in many cases, lowland communities actually had existing trading relationships with these upland neighbors that must have facilitated their integration and cooperation during times of rebellion. Upland ecologies were rich in meat, honey, wax, resins, and precious metals, including gold, in the Cordillera Mountains, while lowland communities would produce common subsistence items that were harder to access in the mountains, things like rice, salt, iron tools or weapons, and manufactured goods. And these trading relationships were established for both sedentary communities like the Ifugao and also semi-sedentary and nomadic communities such as the Aita of the Sierra Madre Mountains, who had temporary camps in the rainforests and lived off bow and arrow hunting, trapping, fishing, and foraging. But the presence of Spanish colonizers in the Cagayan Valley shifted these trading relationships in several ways. In the first instance, lowland communities began introducing swords, firearms, and gunpowder into the mountains, along with iron, farming tools, and other goods that helped to aid the resistance of upland groups against Spanish colonization. Rebellious groups like the Gadang brought with them knowledge of Spanish weaponry, including firearms, lances, and shields, when they moved into these upland communities. And this fundamentally shifted the balance of power between uncolonized communities and Spanish military expeditions, who often relied on the assumption that their firepower would scare indigenous communities into submission. But obviously, when these communities started accumulating their own weaponry, including guns, this was no longer the case. At the same time, the Spanish themselves facilitated this trade. In the 1680s, a network of newly established Spanish forts became focal points for the trade of goods into unsubjugated zones. Goods such as tobacco, wine, salt, iron, and clothes that were shipped to Cagayan for the soldiers of these forts were instead confiscated by corrupt military commanders and funneled illicitly into unconquered and fugitive communities in exchange for wax, gold, and other mountain products. Christianized indigenous allies of the Spanish acted as intermediaries within these trading networks, and their investment in this trade also prompted them to dissuade fugitives from returning to Spanish settlements. Now, some of these migrations may have been temporary, so just long enough to wait for Spanish soldiers or missionaries to retreat, but a more permanent migration flow was recorded into the lower half of the Cagayan Valley, into the region that the Spanish called Itoy. This region was fertile and populous, with large towns of 500 or more that subsisted off a variety of crops, including ginger, sweet potato, and cotton, as well as livestock. Wet and dry rice were cultivated in abundance along the extensive savannas of the Magat River and into the gentle hills of the Caraballo Sur. And this region was known from the 16th century onwards to harbour fugitives and to provide military support for communities in Cagayan who were in uprising against the Spanish. As the Spanish pushed further into the valley in the 18th century, these migrants made their way into the foothills of the Caraballo Sur and Cordillera ranges. And so it is this fight that Stephen Acabado has recently recorded within the archaeological record in the Ifugao region of the Cordillera Mountains. Acabado's findings are significant for the history of the colonial era in the Philippines. They overturn long-held discourses that depicted Philippine mountain communities as untouched or authentic indigenous spaces, separated from their colonized lowland neighbors. By contrast, Acabado interprets Ifugao as a peri-colonial space, an uncolonized region which witnessed social and cultural shifts that paralleled changes within the colonized lowlands. And as we can see here, his research intersects with the colonial archive, demonstrating that migration was a viable response for indigenous people wishing to escape empire, tying this famous history of the autonomous upland spaces in the Cordillera to lowland resistance against colonization. So we can now extend this story beyond northern Luzon. While the mountains of northern Luzon loom large within Philippine history, the reality is that mountainous zones of refuge were present in almost every part of the archipelago. Situated along the Pacific Ring of Fire, Philippine geography has been shaped by millions of years of seismic and volcanic activity, such that most lowland areas are within reach of some kind of rugged, mountainous or volcanic terrain. Throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, dozens of reports describe widespread flight, apostasy, and the existence of intractable, unsubjugated zones within upland spaces across all of the Philippines. And in these regions, missionaries and soldiers were regularly confronted by flight or violence or both. And these reports covered geographies from Antipolo near Manila to Laguna de Bay, Camarines, Mindoro, and many Visayan islands, beginning shortly after the Spanish occupation of Manila in 1571 and rising over the course of the 17th century, suggesting that flight into the uplands escalated in response to colonization. What emerges is therefore a picture of widespread flight into upland areas, resulting in significant impacts on colonization efforts in almost every part of the archipelago. These reports have allowed me to produce a series of detailed maps, which I'm about to show you, and exploring the different dynamics of each region helps to show how this resistance unfolded in different contexts. So beginning with the Visayas, the island south of the main island of Luzon, this impact was felt more deeply as the 17th century progressed. Although the Visayas were the first place where Spanish colonists arrived in the 16th century, Real consolidation of this colonization process did not begin until missionaries, and particularly Jesuits, began expanding their conversion efforts in the 17th century. And Jesuit annual reports document the slow progress of Spanish colonization across this region, hindered by a chronic shortage in available priests and also the remoteness of much of this territory. Islands like Negros and Mindoro lacked a sustained presence of priests, while on other islands, mission sites were restricted to very specific small settlements with large areas lacking regular interaction with priests. At the same time, these reports show that the more missionary efforts increased, so too did acts of flight, apostasy, and attacks on Spanish settlements. So the island of Bohol is an interesting example here. In the early 17th century, Bohol was considered a stronghold of Jesuit activity and a place where Christianization was relatively successful. But in 1621, this image was shattered when most of the Christianized communities rebelled, fleeing Spanish settlements and fortifying themselves in a hill fort in the interior of the island. And it took 6 months for Spanish soldiers to defeat this rebellion. But what is less well known is the aftermath of these events. In the decades that followed, Jesuit annual reports continue to report on the existence of active communities of rebels and apostates in the hills of Bohol. While in 1627, one of the original leaders of the rebellion attempted to foment a new uprising. In 1639, a fire that destroyed the church in Lobok was blamed on these apostates living lawlessly in the mountains. And of course, Bohol is the site of the longest ever rebellion in Philippine history, lasting for 85 years from 1744 to 1829, during which time Boholanos rejected Spanish rule altogether. But even elsewhere in the Visayas, in islands like Leyte, Negros, and Panay, bands of fugitives were reported to rove around the mountains, engaging in idolatrous practices and attacking Spanish settlements. And by 1733, the mountains of Samar were filled with unchristianized fugitives who continuously attacked beaches, settlements, and grain stores, robbing and killing anyone they found and setting fire to houses in the fields. Labor levies were also a common cause of flight. In 1649, the military leader Sumaroy famously led a rebellion against a labor draft, leading his followers to murder a Jesuit priest and then sack and burn the church in Palapag in Samar. These actions served as a signal for the uprising to spread, and churches were then put to flame across the province, while the rebels retreated into the mountains where they fortified themselves. Meanwhile, the rebellion then extended across the Visayas to Camarines, Masbate, Cebu, Caraga, Iligan, northern Mindanao, and Leyte. In spaces like Camarines and the Bicol Peninsula, flight away from Spanish settlements and encomiendas was also a common response to forced labor, taxation, and the requisitioning of agricultural products. Fugitives gathered in their thousands not only in the remote corners of this island, such as Sorsogon, Cantanduanes, and Capolonga, but also in uncontrolled communities that developed on the outskirts of the main Spanish settlement, Nueva Cáceres. From these sites, fugitives regularly raided and attacked the Spanish town and its surrounding agricultural supplies. And Spanish attempts to organize counter-assaults on fugitives in this region were hampered by the fact that most of the allies that they wanted to recruit into their armies were in fact relatives of the fugitives, and so did not really want to do them any harm. And it should be noted in this period that Nueva Cáceres was one of only 6 Spanish cities officially established in the archipelago. The fact that it was surrounded by hostile and uncontrolled forces suggests the limits of Spanish power in this period. On the island of Luzon, flight was similarly recorded across a wide array of regions from Pangasinan and Pampanga to Laguna de Bay and Tayabas. And perhaps this map is the most surprising of all of these maps of zones of refuge in the Philippines, revealing the widespread use of local geographies to escape Spanish colonization in the regions closest to the seat of Spanish power in Manila. Most of the territory covered by this map was home to populations who have long been considered loyal and peaceful subjects of the Spanish, people who participated supposedly more or less willingly in Spanish colonial labor and agricultural regimes. I think this map tells a different story. As early as 1601, Jesuit missionaries noted that the mountains of Antipolo attracted fugitives from nearby Manila, and these reports only continued to increase. In 1700, Cimarrones were reported to have fortified themselves in the dense Malarayat mountain range, leading attacks on the neighboring towns of Tiong and San Pablo. In 1706, the Marine Cove near Palikpikan in Balayan was described as a retreat for criminals of all varieties, all of whom had deserted the service of the crown. Now, zones of refuge were not strictly limited to upland spaces. Although mountain ranges like the Cordillera do loom large within the historical imagination, the Spanish term montes was applied to a wide range of geographies where Spanish colonization was contested. So this would include lowland spaces like the Cagayan Valley, but also the plains of Pangasinan and Nueva Ecija, the heavily forested eastern coast of Luzon and Camarines, as well as the interior of most Visayan islands. In other places, fugitives retreated into forested alcoves that surrounded volcanic mountains like that of Mount Arayat, Mount Makiling, Mount Bamacor, and Mount Malarayat. The Spanish view of such environments as marginal and impenetrable was not just a reflection of the geographical barriers that hindered their access to these spaces. It was also a reaction to these spaces as frequent sites of resistance, refuge, and autonomy. By contrast, local folklore has developed around a number of these places, reflecting their important role within indigenous cultural heritage. One famous example of this is Mount Makiling, which is supposed to look like a beautiful sleeping goddess draped across the landscape overlooking the shores of the Laguna Lake. And according to folklore, the goddess who occupies this mountain, Mariang Makiling, was a fairy-like creature born under the moonbeams who flitted in and out among the woods of the mountain, ruling its environment and the fates of those who lived in her shadow. This legend, made famous by the founding father of Philippine nationalism, Jose Rizal, is just one of many such folk tales that depict Philippine mountains as the abode of ancestor spirits, gods, or goddesses. Another example comes from Mount Arayat in Pampanga, which is another volcano that appears within Histories of Flight, and it's said to be the home of the Kampampanga god Sinikuan. Within these legends, we can identify cultural continuities of pre-Hispanic practices and spiritual beliefs that persist despite the prevalence of Christianizing forces. Unsurprisingly, therefore, we also see that some zones of refuge were used not as permanent retreats, but as places where indigenous people could retreat to practice non-Christian religious customs outside of the watchful and often punitive gaze of Spanish missionaries. So, for example, in 1635, the Jesuits wrote of a notorious hideout in the mountains beyond the town of Maragondon in Cavite, where Christianized Tagalogs would regularly gather with the Cimarrones living in the mountains to practice pagan rites. Deep in these mountains lay a cave which was dedicated to indigenous spirits, with statues carved out of stone and wood that the Jesuits described as fierce and abominable. Similar practices were common across Laguna de Bay. So in 1686, residents of a wide array of Tagalog villages were found to regularly retreat into the nearby mountains of Makaling, Malarayat, and Dagudol, gathering in caves to practice pre-Hispanic ceremonies led by native priestesses known as Catalonas. The Dominican missionary Fray Juan Ibanez spent 6 years climbing into these mountains, and he uncovered remote gullies and mountain caves with the remains of ceremonial practices, including incense and braziers with ashes and coals and preparations of betel nut and tobacco, as well as elaborately carved stone tables with drawers filled with bowls and cups ready for ritual feasting. And such gatherings were performed at least once a month by the people that lived near these mountains, and sometimes even more frequently during times of illness, childbirth, at the beginning of the sowing and harvest seasons, or before embarking on a long journey. Participants in these ceremonies told Fray Ibanez that they took place in secret because of a general fear that they would be burnt alive if the Spanish found out. So also, as in northern Luzon, flight away from lowland settlements led fugitives into upland spaces that were already inhabited by communities that remained unsubjugated by the colonial state. For a large part of the archipelago, this meant joining communities of Aita, who were also commonly referred to by the Spanish as negritos or negrillos. These are believed to be the descendants of the first migrants to the Philippines prior to Malay colonization. As nomadic communities who lived off bow and arrow hunting and gathering, the Aita presented a concerted challenge to Spanish colonization. They rejected European notions of settled congregation and Christianity. And despite this, Aita have more often been represented within Philippine history as victims of multiple waves of colonization, which forced them into more marginal and remote lands. Numerous archaeologists have by now challenged this narrative, which places the Aita as remnants of a lost indigenous past in competition with their lowland neighbours over access to territory and forest resources. So the archival record relating to flight into mountains suggests that when lowlanders fled into Aita territories, they were actually often welcomed into existing communities, forming new networks of exchange, as well as the emergence of new ethnic formations. So, for example, the Bishop of Nueva Cáceres noted in 1656 that Aita communities in Camarines welcomed refugees into their communities and would often defend them with their bows and arrows. In 1696, the Jesuits wrote of a conspiracy among the communities of Panay to flee Jesuit settlements and to join together with the Aita. And by 1733, the indigenous leaders of Christian settlements in Camarines were reporting that large groups of Aita, Cimarrones, and apostates living in the mountains frequently robbed their settlements, stealing livestock and crops, and sometimes using poisoned arrows or darts, resulting in 2 or 3 deaths among the villagers each year. So where indigenous communities saw mountains as important spiritual sites, the Spanish viewed them as geographies beyond the margins of imperial control, depicted as inaccessible, wild, and untamable. Environmental discourses were also accompanied by descriptions of the inhabitants of these spaces as wild, barbarian, savages, apostates, heathens, enemies. And the most vitriolic epitaphs were often reserved for the Zambales, who were described as thieves and barbarians who continually raided and disrupted Spanish settlements in neighboring Pampanga, which was the province the Spanish relied on most for its labor and agricultural supplies. As prominent headhunters, the Zambales were accused of slurping out the brains of their victims and using their skulls as drinking vessels. But also the inhabitants of the Eastern Cordillera were known headhunters, and they were described as butchers by Captain Garcia de Aldana Cabrera in 1620. In Camarines, the Franciscan missionary Fray Vicente Ingles described unpacified inhabitants of the mountains as wild beasts, despicable, bloodthirsty, deceitful, and enemies of humankind. And within these colonial discourses, a common distinction was made between barbaros and apostatas, or old enemies and new enemies. In other words, indigenous communities who had never been colonized were differentiated from indigenous people who had once been incorporated into the colonial state and had then chosen to abandon colonial settlements and seek refuge within impenetrable, uncontrolled landscapes. And while both of these communities represented rebelliousness in the eyes of the Spanish, fugitives who abandoned Spanish settlements were considered more dangerous, since they had gathered knowledge, skills, and social connections that could be used to their advantage when raiding or attacking Spanish settlements. And raiding was actually a very common tactic used by fugitives to disrupt and destabilize colonial settlements. So, for example, we have many reports from Camarines in the 1720s that speak of attacks on the Spanish settlement of Nueva Cáceres and also surrounds. For example, in 1720, the priest Don Jose Fuentes was praying in a chapel in the Caramoan Peninsula when he was shot with arrows by Aitas. And just the following year, Don Manuel Cardoso claimed to have lost up to 100 head of cattle to poison arrows used by Cimarrones who had come to poach meat from his estate. And in Pampanga, raids by the inhabitants of the Zambales Mountains were experienced regularly. They often resulted in killings, robberies, and other hostilities. Both Spaniards and native elites loyal to the Spanish could not leave their towns, actually without an armed escort, for fear of being ambushed by the Zambales. And in some towns, the Pampangans required armed guards even when they were tending to their fields, especially during harvest time, and single travelers were often attacked along the roads that passed north from Pampanga to Pangasinan. So despite a perception that the Spanish maintained military superiority over indigenous communities, encounters within upland spaces were often more evenly balanced. Indigenous communities were able to use their detailed knowledge of local terrains, seasonal weather patterns, and ecologies to their advantage in these encounters. Philippine mountain spaces were sites of friction, unruliness, and insurgency. For both missionaries and soldiers, difficulties in navigating through rugged and unknown terrains often presented the first barrier to reaching remote or fugitive communities. For example, in 1601, two Jesuit missionaries traveling through the mountains of the Visayan island of Samar described having to scale up cliffs with their bare hands and wade through thigh-high water and knee-high mud. More than a century later, missionaries working in the Caraballo Sur mountains noted that rivers often overflowed their banks during the rainy season, and this would cut off potential mission sites for months at a time. And the progress of military expeditions into the Cordillera Mountains was slowed by paths that ran through reed beds and over fallen trees, as well as sweeping rains, thunder and lightning, and great fogs that would cloak the mountains. In the 1620s, many of the soldiers exploring the Cordillera fell ill from waterborne diseases. And ignorant of local flora and fauna, military commanders often perceived of mountain environments as hostile and barren, and so the need for constant supply lines of provisions into mountain camps made permanent occupation of these spaces basically impossible. But the same environmental conditions could be turned into strategic assets by indigenous communities. So Igorots tracked the progress of Spanish soldiers and missionaries into their territories, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to evade encounters by abandoning and sometimes even burning down their towns. They also conducted surprise ambushes on Spanish soldiers, hiding skilled archers in trees or craggy outposts, or using narrow passes to force the Spanish into defensive battles. And mountains were actually also ideal locations for indigenous fortifications. So Igorot settlements were almost always situated on the top of a mountain summit with one path leading upwards that could easily be defended. And the Sayans likewise built hill fortifications. For example, the rebels of Bohol in 1621 built a stone fortification and then gathered clods of earth to throw at the troops that were assaulting this fort. And they also placed sharp stakes in the ground around the fort and positioned bowmen in the trees. And all of these tactics allowed them to resist Spanish assaults for about 6 months. Similarly, in 1649, the rebel leader Sumaroy and his followers fortified themselves at the top of an impregnable mountain near Palapak in Samar. And this mountain had only one narrow and difficult path leading to the top. The rebels then littered this path with sharp stakes, snares, and stone boulders suspended perilously over the path, and they used ambush tactics to prevent Spanish soldiers from assaulting the fort. But my favorite example of indigenous fortification actually comes from the mid-18th century from the Itinay village of Pitoy in the mountains of Nueva Vizcaya. This fort featured a permanent garrison of densely spaced mannequins, so a kind of doll made of sticks and straw and armed with lances and shields, and it was designed to give the impression from afar that the village was under heavy guard. And agricultural practices also facilitated community evasion of the colonial state. As Philippine communities escaped into the mountains, population pressures necessitated the adoption of larger scale, more intensive forms of agriculture. In regions like Ifugao, communities did not need to limit their subsistence to hunting, foraging, or swinning, since they were protected from colonial incursions through the friction of terrain and distance. Wet rice agriculture facilitated political consolidation, which allowed the Ifugao to muster an organized response to Spanish military incursions. So the insurgent ecologies of Philippine mountains helped make them successful zones of refuge. Over time, the Spanish came to the realization that conquest of these spaces would only ever be possible through a massive investment in force and violence. By the end of the 17th century, even missionaries argued that fugitive, apostate, and autonomous communities would never hear the voice of God without first having heard the thunderclap of the arquebus. Missionaries frequently became the most vocal advocates of violent methods of conquest, arguing for the militarization of zones like Cagayan, Camarines, and the Zambales Mountains, the burning and destruction of farmlands and gardens among mountain communities, the enslavement of unpacified uplanders, and hanging the bodies of fugitives and rebels along highways as a warning to others. But despite these entreaties for escalating frontier violence, the Spanish consistently lacked the military requirements to undertake these missions. Throughout the 17th century, they suffered from a chronic shortage in soldiers and were forced to choose between these multiple frontiers of conquest and rebellion. So I wanted to just begin to conclude by returning to ask what's at stake here. Why do these histories of flight into mountains matter, and how do they change the way we understand the colonial period in the Philippines? The first point to make is that by extending this analysis of upland resistance beyond the traditional geographic scope of the Cordillera region of northern Luzon, we are challenging a long-standing divide that has separated the histories of upland and lowland communities in the Philippines. And this in turn has implications for how we understand the category of indigeneity. We see this first in the Cordillera itself, where it was long assumed that so-called Igorots were remnants of untouched societies outside the scope of the colonial state. But as we've seen here, it's not actually possible to genuinely understand the history of Cordillera resistance without also understanding the events that unfolded in neighboring lowlands. Beginning in the 16th century, communities from the Cagayan Valley migrated in their thousands away from Spanish colonial efforts, with valley communities funneling arms and other resources into zones of refuge in order to facilitate their autonomy. And when considering questions of ethnogenesis, this therefore disrupts the idea that indigenous communities in the mountains were static and historyless entities. As Stephen Acabado has shown for the Ifugao, key cultural markers of Ifugao identity, including rice terracing and rituals associated with rice cultivation, developed alongside large-scale migration into the mountains in response to colonization. And this story is not unique to the Cordillera, but took place all over the archipelago. Early 20th century anthropologists documented the persistence of these zones of refuge up to the end of Spanish colonial rule. The hilly terrain of Nueva Vizcaya, which connects the southern reaches of the Cordillera, Sierra Madre, and Caraballo Sur mountains, was recorded in the American census of 1903 as having the highest number of unpacified communities anywhere in the archipelago, with nearly 3/4 of inhabitants described as living wild. During the same period, the American anthropologist David P. Barrows remarked that even along the mostly peaceful western coastline of Ilocos, Christianized settlements extended only for 2 to 5 miles from the coast, giving way quickly to rancherias of the infieles. When Audley Bayer produced the first detailed population study of the archipelago in 1916, he found hill peoples across central and southern Luzon and the Visayas, who were commonly held to be descendants of remontados or outlaws from the Christian towns who fled to the hills and there mixed with wandering bands of Negritos. The largest such communities he found were on the Visayan islands of Negros and Panay, where combined more than 30,000 so-called mundos continued to adopt non-sedentary lifeways. Unlike the Igorots of northern Luzon or the myriad indigenous groupings of Mindanao, these remontados confronted colonial racial classifications because, as ethnic Malays, they defied expectations about the success of Spanish colonization in the archipelago. The migration of lowlanders into Aita spaces also led to the emergence of new ethnic formations whose very names, Aita Cimarron, Dumagat Remontados, manifest their histories of resistance to colonial control. Across the Visayas and Mindanao, these groups are often referred to as Bukidnon, an epithet that, like Igorot, means people of the mountains. And yet, working with the Sulod Bukidnon in Panay in the 1950s, the anthropologist Landa Jocano recovered epic poems that spoke more of the sea than of the mountains, suggesting these groups had migrated inland away from coastal areas. Such histories of migration and movement into mountain spaces are found in folklore from around the islands. Like the Sulod, Ifugao oral histories speak of large rivers, the likes of which cannot be found in the mountains, hinting at the path of migration taken by the ancestors of the Ifugao from the Magat and Cagayan river valleys. On the opposite side of the Cordillera, an Ilocos Cancanay song recorded in the 1980s tells of a migration up the Amburayan River away from Spanish construction projects that resulted in increased taxation and labor demands. And even in areas where colonization eventually did take place, substantial histories of resistance can still be told that begin with flight into mountain spaces. I already mentioned briefly the instance of the Visayan island of Bohol, where frequent episodes of flight into the 17th century led to the largest ever rebellion against Spanish rule in the 18th century. Linguists have speculated that this lengthy rebellion may have contributed to the development of Eskaya, which is a language that was first identified by linguists in southeastern Bohol in the 1980s. And the leader of this famous rebellion, Dagohoy, is still commemorated as a folk hero and incorporated within ancestor worship on the island of Bohol. Ulysses Aparece writes that he grew up with stories from the distant past of headless Spanish priests walking in empty streets, condenados dragging metal chains, and spirit warriors in hot pursuit of Spanish soldiers. In short, this history of flight into Philippine zones of refuge sheds new light on what William Henry Scott once described as the mess of Philippine ethnohistory. But at the same time, these histories of flight, apostasy, and zones of refuge also demand a new reflection on the limits of Spanish sovereignty within the archipelago. Despite claims to widespread successes in establishing encomiendas and converting communities to Christianity across Philippine lowlands, Spanish control was often limited to coastal and riverine outposts that were easy to access and supply. As elsewhere in the empire, missionaries made attempts to reduce the largely dispersed Philippine population into these settlements, but the limits of Spanish control within the interior of most islands presented ample opportunity for individuals and communities to simply move away from Spanish settlements. So adopting the view from the mountains dramatically shifts our understanding of the colonial period in the Philippines, turning away from an emphasis on the establishment of Spanish power and institutional control towards the experience of local communities. This history challenges historians of later periods to look back on the early colonial period not as one of enduring colonial control, but rather as a period of chronic instability and colonial advance and retreat that created only a patchwork empire. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating history and suggesting a really new approach to how one might rethink that history and also rewrite it. So to all those in the audience, please feel free to use the raise hand function or the Q&A box if you have any questions. While people are thinking and perhaps formulating questions, maybe I'll begin just with a couple basic things that came to my mind when you were speaking here today. So I thought that the way that you set up the talk from the very beginning and talking about different vantage points, telling different stories, and shifting the position or the perspective away from the colonialist story to indigenous perspectives is a really significant and powerful one to do. But I was curious throughout the talk, I was trying to get a better sense of precisely what are the types of sources that one can actually use to do this other than traditional colonial narratives and things like that. So I think towards the end, you started to mention things like folklore and songs and things like that might be one way of access. But I was wondering if you could just give a little better sense of what some of those sources are. Are they are these sort of newly available sources, or is it also a rereading of older sources that were available, but reading them in a different way? That would be one question that I would like to hear, just how one might proceed with further work in this area to try to adopt the methodology that you have laid out for us. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess one of my my views on Philippine history is that, or historiography, is that it's kind of over relied on published and mostly religious chronicles, and these are, you know, perfectly fine sources, but they're limited because they're also political documents. So they're designed in order to kind of present a particular view of the success of, particularly of Christianization. And so what I did in writing the article, in writing the book, was that I actually put those sources aside and went deep into the archive and tried to gather as much sort of, I guess the pieces of evidence are really from all over the place. And I would say probably most people who are familiar with the history of the Philippines wouldn't really be that surprised by this story. It's sort of something that's known, but very difficult to actually put together in a kind of coherent way, because the pieces of evidence are really, you can't kind of go to that archive and type in mountains or fly to, I mean, you can, but you only get a certain amount of information that way. So firstly, the first source is really like deep archival work. And that's something that came to me, I guess, looking at other things. So it sort of emerged out of a longer process of archival research. And then I think really the trying to kind of look beyond a colonial viewpoint, and to try to understand this history from an indigenous perspective as much as we possibly can, but we don't have sources that are authored by people from those communities. I think that involves looking to things like archaeology where it exists. Stephen Akabato, a big fan of his. He's quite famous now, but there are also other archaeologists like Laura Lee Juncker who have done amazing work, and really sort of connected some of these pieces of the puzzle. And then, of course, folklore and oral histories where they exist. And in terms of the last part of your question, I think that that's the sort of new direction that could be taken with future research. So I'd be interested in trying to follow this story beyond the 17th and early 18th century. And that, I think, would mean looking more to the ethnographic and anthropological record. Yeah, so it's exciting. I think there's more work that can be done.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that was, I think the issue of archaeology is probably a really key one here too. And in the absence of other questions, I'll press forward with a second one that I had then, which is the mountain side of things. As somebody who also had done work on mountain areas in China, I was really interested in the way that you wove in the work of Stephen Acevedo and I guess the study of the rice terraces, which is presumably is archaeological as well, and which then seems to also perhaps present a narrative that's rather different than what we often assume, which is to say that mountains as places of habitation or even of refuge, in your case, aren't as deep as one thinks. In fact, in the pre-modern period throughout other parts of Asia where mountains were, we have I think a kind of romantic era period idea of mountains where we today think, to go off into the mountains is this way to kind of purify our souls and what have you. But in the pre-modern period, mountains were often, perceived to be rather dangerous places inhabited by, malevolent spirits and the abode of the dead and all of that kind of thing. So I'm wondering through your, you had some intriguing places in your talk where you referred to the kind of indigenous kind of spiritual ideas about mountains and things like that. And I'm wondering if the model that I've just kind of spoken of right now resonates with that, or if you have other information from the research that you've done just about the conception, sort of a changing conception over time of just exactly what mountains were representing to indigenous people, or how they were perceived in a religious sense as well.
Yeah, it's really difficult to, I guess, to know exactly how people thought about it, because we don't have those kind of records from. We have this very biased colonial archive that tells us a lot about what Spaniards thought about things, but not so much about what local communities thought. So really, what we have is the evidence comes from their actions rather than their kind of like a deep understanding of their thought. But I suppose some of both the anthropological, archaeological, and historical evidence is is showing that people migrate. They were coastal communities that migrated into the mountains, and the question becomes when this happened. And so there's sort of intriguing evidence that some of these sort of communities that we think of as mountain people actually weren't until quite recently. And that's interesting because it suggests that perhaps rather than like kind of scary places or malevolent places, mountains they were zones of refuge. They were places of they kind of hospitable places where people could actually make homes. And I find that quite interesting. From the religious point of view, I suppose, the traditional view of Philippine religion is that, or pre-Hispanic belief is that spirits inhabited the natural world, and so it makes sense that things like mountains and particularly volcanoes would be seen as sites of particular spiritual importance. And the classic view from the Spanish was that the Filipinos didn't have any temples, or they didn't really have any kind of places of worship, and that's true in one sense. A lot of kind of religious practices took place within the home. But also we do have in these records sort of evidence of people using things like caves or gullies or particular environmental sites that were imbued with some kind of spiritual meaning to them, and whether that was taking place before the Spanish arrived, or whether it's a response to the Spanish arrival and the need to find like a kind of safe space to be able to continue doing the things that you need to do. I'm not sure how to answer that. Certainly I've been to places in the Philippines where like caves and gullies and are still clearly used in this fashion. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, it reminds me of the work of J.J. Gibson, this idea of affordances, of how humans throughout time will maximize the sort of potentialities of certain geographic formations, whether it's caves or hidden valleys and that kind of thing. And humans have tended cross-culturally to be very perceptive about the potential uses for those, both in practical sense, but also in symbolic senses and mapping of meaning onto them as well, of certain shapes of things, and that leads into some of the images you showed, or the folklore about a reclining goddess or something like that, and just how a kind of topographical shape can take on that kind of meaning. So thank you, that's very interesting. So we have one question that came in just about the role of women in the resistance to colonization in your research, if you've come across that, and what role did that play?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the same problem of this extremely biased colonial record. So, I mean, we rarely get names, we rarely get, any sense of who people are. But definitely women do play a very important role within this period of history, both as leaders of rebellions, where there's occasionally we get notified within the source that, it was a woman that led this rebellion, but also as spiritual leaders. So, I referenced some of as we were talking just now about caves and gullies, some of the documents about that talk about female spiritual leaders, and they're the ones that are actually maintaining the tradition. And there's this kind of division there between the kind of martial male leader figure and a female spiritual leader. But of course, the Spanish chronicles in particular tend to diminish the power of women. And so actually we have to look to other types of sources to kind of reclaim that space for women. So one of the sources that I recently looked at were Inquisition records. And there, all of a sudden, you have these powerful female spiritual leaders who are actually doing all kinds of things, for providing magical services even to the Spanish community and so on. And so in that sense, I think more could probably be done with trying to put together all of the information about women in the early colonial period of the Philippines. But it's difficult. So it's a similar problem of like disparate information and then having to kind of, I guess, read critically the documents that we have. So, for example, I do have a list from one region of spiritual leaders, which is about 100 names long, and like 96 of them are women. But then you go and read the chronicle, and it only wants to talk about the men. So, yeah.
Yeah, same. I mean, you're dealing with the double problem of the different types of silences in our historical record, whether it's indigenous people or women, the two common culprits of being not included or written out of the record in many ways. So anyway, that's fascinating to see what the little glimpses that you can get. I mean, sometimes I think what you've done is cleverly shown as well how one can use some aspects of the colonial record, or perhaps you also have in the what you were calling a kind of deeper archive, are those who were just a little bit different than the say the how to put it, the administrative kind of side of the colonial enterprise, that were writing records and writing alternative kind of histories, maybe not intentionally, but just more kind of ethnographic in nature, or just very, I mean, I guess that raises the one of the thoughts I had was just that, I faced a similar issue in looking at some of the material on China, where everybody loves to hate the missionaries and the colonizers and all of that come in, and particularly the missionaries. But in some cases, in their in just how much they sort of are revealing their hatred and trying to describe how horrible this everything is, they were actually the closest observers, and actually preserve things that ironically don't necessarily support their own narrative, but can be used to actually capture part of that story that's been lost, which I've sort of find interesting and as another resource, right, in their efforts to kind of rid the world or rid the area of these people. In fact, they became in some cases the best preservers of what we know. So there's a real irony there. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's definitely the case. And I mean, missionary records is this hugely rich source of information. I mean, particularly the ones that aren't published. So when you go to the kind of the letters that missionaries are writing to each other and things like that, you get fascinating kind of glimpses into daily life and the interaction. And that's also where some of this information about, like, we can see just how small the kind of field of control or of influence is, because the missionaries are complaining heavily about that, and the kind of like trajectories, I guess, of flight away from missions and Spanish settlements comes through those sources.
Mm-hmm. So we have a new question about, and this is one actually I was thinking about as well, so I'm glad somebody asked it, which is, if you're building on this idea of humans seeing the potential of mountains as spaces of refuge and resistance, do these mountains continually become such areas of continued resistance, even until the end of the Spanish colonial regime and the start of the American conquest of the islands as well? Sort of looking forward.
I mean, arguably they still are.
Yeah.
Yeah, particularly that area in the mountains of northern Luzon are still kind of contested areas. And definitely there's been movements even until today for like Cordillera autonomy or yeah, and Maoist insurgency and things like that. And so, I mean, I think it's quite an interesting story in that it's one that I haven't followed through yet, but I would like to in future research, and that's the kind of role of internal migration within the Philippines as the actual colonizing force that's settled these lowland regions that were rebellious, and then kind of pushed the more rebellious communities into what we call the kind of traditional indigenous zones. And I think that was taking place more in the kind of late 18th and through the 19th century. So there was a lot of internal migration of particularly Ilocanos. They settled the Cagayan Valley. Yeah, so I think, I mean, yes, it's basically a story that does definitely continue, but it's not one that I would say is static. So I wouldn't want to kind of, without having done the research, kind of foreground what it is that we might conclude from that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, indeed, not well. You're dealing with two of the main kind of categories of time and space here, right? And so you have what seems to me, at least what I learned from your talk too, both not static and changes over time, but also kind of regional differences that that are conditioned by the particular areas, which I think is something we would expect, but isn't always something that is captured in the stories that are told. So another question from the audience, I think that the isolation of communities in the mountainous regions of remote areas gave rise to some cults or even syncretic movements. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I know enough about that to answer that question, but I mean, I think that this is something that definitely happened in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And I mean, I guess that I have read quite a lot of anthropology about the way in which kind of pre-Hispanic beliefs continue today, and in these sort of kind of hidden, like culturally hidden ways. So, people will go to church, but then they will also go to their local spirit medium and things like that, and that the were completely compatible. It's just that you don't ever mix them. So it's this interesting kind of, I mean, and I would argue that kind of practice today is a product of this history. So we have had to have this history of people kind of fighting to preserve their culture and their spiritual beliefs and their heritage, and doing so quite effectively, whilst also having this parallel history of Christianization and colonization. I think that's something that maybe isn't as well acknowledged within the historiography of the Philippines, because, or at least within this period, is sort of a standard depiction of a steady colonial control, and in some ways that's the least interesting story that we can tell here. So yeah, I don't think I answered the question, but
yeah, it's probably difficult if there's very a few resources to be able to that are capturing what those narratives are, to be able to represent it well. I was really struck by your one of the key takeaway points, I think, which is the fact that the upland areas and the lowland areas are related. And this is, I think, something that the danger of polarizing those two is easy, because one sees kind of the riverine areas low down, and then the opposition to these high mountains and rains and everything that happen up there in the clouds. But the fact is that the lowlands are dependent upon the uplands for all kinds of natural resources, whether it's wood or whether it's certain minerals or whatever, plants and things like that. Seems to be sort of a natural way of those two being connected as well. But the question, this is maybe a little bit, it's a little tangential to what your talk was about, but I think other parts of it are so clear that it led me to ask this, which is maybe drawing on some of your other work as well, which is to say that, as you demonstrated in your talk, that those who went into the upland areas, they knew how to survive very well. They knew how to live and to prosper, even, it sounds like, up in those areas. And so in order to do that, they probably had to be very close observers of the natural world, and also knowing and learning about what the resources were. So were there sort of unintended consequences, I guess, or byproducts of this movement gradually up? I mean, I guess the thing that got me thinking about was the technology of what it takes to do rice terracing, and that's a very complicated and highly technological advancement to be able to do that at that scale. So it led me to ask this question about the kind of what other forms of what we might think of as kind of science or technology came out of this. If there were other examples that you had beyond the rice terracing, that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I guess, I mean, perhaps what I didn't explain in the talk is that prior to colonization, Philippine communities were relatively dispersed, so they weren't necessarily, it's not an urban society in that sense, and I guess most communities would have been semi-sedentary. So I mean, typically, even when you're growing rice, you have a rice season, and then you have a season where you go and forage. And it's to me, it's an open question how much rice was cultivated prior to Spanish colonization. It's a question that I have, because there's an assumption that it's a predominantly rice-based society. But actually, when the Spanish came, they demanded tribute, and it was often paid in kind, so often in rice and other agricultural products. And so this would have placed extensive burdens on communities to produce extra surpluses of rice. So I think it's a really interesting question that I don't have an answer to, which is to what extent colonization changed the agricultural landscape of lowland Philippines. But then I guess when people are moving away from the lowlands into the mountains, they are bringing this knowledge and technological advancement, or not necessarily advancement, but technology with them into new spaces. And so the theory with the Ifugao rice terraces is that potentially first terraces like this, maybe not of that scale, were further down in the Magat Valley, and then they brought the technology into the Cordillera as they migrated inland. I don't know if we can answer whether that's actually the case. But also the expansion of these terraces did change the ecology of those environments as well. So they used to do a lot more kind of foraging and sweetening and growing of sweet potatoes and that sort of thing. And that was replaced by rice farming. I'm not sure. I mean, I know a little bit about like Ita in the Sierra Madre Mountains and logging, which is a big problem now. So deforestation and the encroachment on indigenous lands by people who are, trying to get by through deforestation, illegal logging. But that's more of a modern story. I guess I'd have to think a bit about other technological
Yeah, sure. No.
examples. Yeah.
I was just thinking things that might flow down from the uplands to the lowlands, which particularly like perhaps medicinal things for developments in medicine and things like that. But any case, we have one final question. I think this will be the last one we can fit in, which is just really about going back to the issue of sources. And it's nice that we had seemed a number of people signing in from the Philippines today as well, but also turning our attention back to local historians and the areas which you work and have. Are some of those is there a development of a kind of local history by local historians that are keeping records or doing this that you also draw on in your own work? And I think that's an appropriate place to draw this to an end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some really great work that's been done, and particularly around like the Camarines and Bicol Peninsula by local historians there. And I mean, this is sort of I would say this is a topic that I think I said before most people would know about, but it's never really been pieced together in this way. So local historians have definitely traced these kind of movements of people within local histories, but the sense of it being actually a global or like widespread problem in the Philippines is borne out when we bring all of the evidence together. So, and I mean, there's definitely great work being done.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And it was a fascinating talk, and also a kind of a fascinating challenge to us as for people interested in, particularly in the pre-colonial contact period as well, and just how we can better understand that period even further. And I know there's interesting work going on all over the Philippines, and everybody different scholars trying to piece that record together in any way we can, with despite a very thin kind of material, textual, and in some cases material record to draw on. So hopefully everybody will keep up this work, and it's an important period to cover, and a lot to learn there, and across the entire length and breadth of the Philippines as well, from north to south. So thank you for sharing what you've done, and appreciate you taking the time to speak today. And also thanks for everybody for signing into the talk today. It's been wonderful to have you. And hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. You're welcome, Stephanie. Bye. Thank you, everyone.